a biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
You might have caught one of the most important international headlines this week. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, resigned from leadership of the worldwide Anglican Communion. Now, you'll know him as the man who presided over the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II and the coronation of King Charles, as well as conducting the wedding of Prince William and Princess Catherine. Well, he was under pressure over historic allegations from the 1970s that he didn't respond appropriately to accusations against John Smythe, a summer camp leader who groomed and abused more than 100 boys in the UK and Africa. An independent report concluded that Justin Welby had a moral responsibility to take things further. Now, Justin Welby has resigned, saying it was in the best interests of the Church of England. We might be wondering what this resignation means for Australian Anglicans who are part of the worldwide Anglican Communion, especially since many consider Justin Welby to have been a woke Archbishop. Well, our special guest today is David Ould. He's Senior Associate Minister at St John's Anglican Cathedral in Parramatta in Sydney. Originally from the UK and unapologetically defends biblical Christianity and has been monitoring developments. David Ould, a special welcome back to 2020.
Oh, thank you, Neil. Always good to be with you, even if it's a difficult thing we have to talk about.
It is a difficult thing, but let's start with perhaps some good things and some context here, because, you know, for a lot of people thinking, oh, the Anglican Church, that's that little church, that one that's old, it's down the street. Is this part of a big organisation or what? Well, the Anglican Communion counts something like 85 million members around the world, so you're a part of a very significant movement, David.
Yes, we are. And it's really grown out of, obviously, as the British Empire expanded, the Church of England went out with it. And now there are thriving Anglican churches all over the world. Probably the real numbers are in Africa, places like Nigeria and on the east coast of Africa as well. But yes, all around the world, Christians who identify themselves as Anglicans, maybe not so many left in England after all, but more than enough of us worldwide to make up the difference.
And we are going to be getting into the deep end, and we're going to be talking about scandal and controversy, but it's not just Anglicans who have been under this sort of scrutiny. This is one that, you know, now for perhaps more than a decade, maybe multiple decades, of course, Catholics have been tied to a whole lot of abuse allegations as well. So Anglican Church, Catholic Church, but really we're talking about any significant denomination.
Yeah, absolutely. And we might later on in our time together talk about how that's impacted here in Australia as well.
The other thing that's going to be important, and we can get to this a little bit later, is with the resignation of Justin Welby, there'll be speculation as to who might succeed him. And for listeners, you might want to stick around. We might be able to talk about some of those things too. But David, let's talk about the issues around Justin Welby, what's led to his resignation. Several survivors of the abuse at the hand of John Smythe were calling for that resignation of Justin Welby. What are your perceptions about what's been going on that's led up to this?
Well, let's get down to the absolute nut of the issue. Probably the closest comparison we've got in Australia is the resignation of Hollingworth, then Governor General, but formerly an Archbishop, who had to resign when it became quite clear he hadn't properly dealt with allegations of sexual abuse by a priest that he had responsibility for. And it's much the same thing going on here. So Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, it now is clear from the report which the Church of England has finally issued, much delayed after many years. It's called the Macon Report. It's not obviously available online. Very clear that in 2013, when he became Archbishop of Canterbury, and that must be a huge thing, right? I mean, you just any new job of that responsibility, you start your first day and in come the civil servants and go, here are all the things for your desk now for you to go through. But one of those things was a very clear report that John Smythe, and this was in 2013, Welby would have received this, that John Smythe clearly had abused young men on what were known as the Ewan camps in the late 70s. And the allegation and the report is very, very clear Let me read to it from it. The conclusion that must be reached is that John Smythe could and should have been reported to the police in 2013. And that immediately after saying it's Welby that was told about this. So that's the crux of it. But it actually is a bit deeper than that, Neil, because Welby himself attended those camps in the 70s and, as it were, graduated to become an officer. And that tells you a little bit about the culture of the camps, that name is given to a camp leader. Became an officer of the camps, gave talks, contributed towards Smythe's ministries, if we can call them that, elsewhere. And it is alleged in the report that he was well aware long before 2013 that Smythe was, and I quote, a very bad man.
In fact, a little bit of information that I came across is that Welby twice shared a dormitory with Smythe while attending the camps, and he might even have an association there, and given that he's making financial contributions, a friend of John Smythe. So difficult when you have friendships and your friend has an accusation. You're in charge of a huge church movement that blankets the earth, and you're thinking, how do I maintain the integrity of the church, be seen to be doing the right thing, and keeping some levels of confidentiality, and not compromise the safety of parishioners? There's a lot of things to hold into balance here.
There is, Neil, and I think, to be fair to Welby, I don't think the language of friendship is the appropriate language to describe the relationship. Smythe would have been at least a generation older than him, so it would be more a respect within a particular culture for Smythe, and yet when you become the Archbishop of Canterbury, that no longer is a barrier, I would have thought, to doing something about things.
Even though here in Australia we might feel as though there's a weeding out of these things, and perhaps we're safer now than we've ever been, but of course, the thought of cover-ups, and these things going back 50 years, it's almost unbelievably difficult for anyone to be able to, have an accountability for things that happened 50 years ago. Often we're not the same people as those things that happened in our early years. But the cover-up idea, this is something that is really in play right now, and this is a responsibility that every church minister has, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, and not just in the area of. I mean, this was physical abuse of young men. I don't think there's any suggestion it was overtly sexual in nature. There are other things going on in the Church of England, like Jonathan Fletcher. The issues around him, they clearly were more sexualized. And of course, we have our own. We had our own report on institutional responses to sexual abuse here in Australia, where the churches have quite rightly, where necessary, taken an absolute shellacking on the way that in the past they've handled it. But the real issue here is not the nature of the abuse, but the failure to deal with it. Because we've even had just in the last couple of years some significant church leaders here in Australia who quite clearly have abused their position, this time with adults, behaved inappropriately, it seems, with women, with adult women. And again, we've got leadership around them who have been, for some reason, cowed or felt unable to address these matters. So I think it's not just about children, it's about that broader thing of where we see people behaving in abusive ways, no matter who the victim is, and just the failure to say no, to deal with it, to have the courage to speak out.
Back onto Justin Welby and his position. He's resigned now, and this is interesting because there's a connection here between church and state. You might have your own thoughts here, and given your heritage there to the UK, but the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he's effectively made Welby's decision untenable when he said he was going to stay on. And he's in the mix here because while he has said this man needs to go, he's also the one who would be recommending any new successor to the King. Is there a church and state issue here? Because Keir Starmer is known to be of the fairly radical left on political positions here, and some might even align that with being fairly anti-Christian. So is there a church and state issue here?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in that the Church of England officially is part of the state. The king is the supreme governor, and so on. And in the chain of recommendations for a diocesan bishop, the prime minister is involved. But the reality is going to be slightly different. The situation now is it's a little bit less like the Yes Prime Minister days of yours, that famous clip of Hacker having to deal with a nomination. The reality is now that we have what's called a Crown Nominations Commission for when a diocese becomes vacant. The Crown Nominations Commission is made up out of, it would be the Archbishop of York and the Archbishop of Canterbury. This time, of course, the Archbishop of Canterbury won't be part of it. 6 elected members from the diocese itself and 6 members elected by the General Synod, which is the national church parliament of the Church of England. They get together and they make a single name recommendation to the Prime Minister. They have to have a decent majority of people on that commission making that recommendation. We do know that they now operate basically from a pool that's been pre-prepared for them of sort of, suitable candidates in general. And there'll be a lot, obviously, of outside lobbying on that. Once the name goes from that commission, however, it's a dead cert. It's given to the Prime Minister. His job is then to say yes or no. But effectively, if he was to say no, we would have a constitutional crisis because that's just the way the British things work. There's all this power, but no power. The Prime Minister then takes it to the King, who as governor actually makes the appointment. The King, of course, technically has the right to say no, but of course he won't, because if he says no, we have another constitutional crisis, and it just doesn't do it. So it's actually the power rests in this Crown Nominations Commission, and so all the interest will be looking at them, who they're discussing, and who they end up nominating.
So you've got what some will say is a woke government, and you've got this labelling of Justin Welby as a woke archbishop. So what I'm going to just sort of throw you in the deep end here.
Sure.
I mean, is this threat or opportunity that Justin Welby has resigned? What will this likely mean for the Anglican communion worldwide? And is there a sort of a ripple effect that flows on to Australia?
Well, there certainly will be a ripple effect. So the question will be who will be nominated, and there's really 2 things that are in play. One is the internal stuff that's going on inside the Church of England, and so they're going through this living in love and faith process, which really is a process for asking whether we're going to have gay marriage or not in the church. That process has caused incredible division, and at the moment it's at a standstill because while it seems to be recognised by all involved that there's going to be some sort of gay marriage voted for, at the same time the Conservatives are going, we need a proper and appropriate provision for our position, probably a third province or something like that. So will we get an Archbishop of Canterbury who supports There'll be one who supports the living with love and faith process, no doubt. Will we get one who looks after the Conservatives and gives them what they need? That's the big question. Of course, it will have to be someone who has the chops on safeguarding. How can it not be, given that was the cause of the resignation of Canterbury? But then you've got the global Anglican communion to think of, which is in an absolute crisis itself. GAFCON, the Conservative movement within the communion, have basically rejected the leadership of Welby over these sexuality issues, and they have been saying, look, long gone are the days when we have this colonial attitude where, the Brits get to tell us how things go. Surely the communion, the global communion, should have a say in the next Archbishop of Canterbury. If he wants to be head of a global communion, we should have some participation in that. So those voices will be raised. And at that point, Neil, I just think anybody who says they've got a shoe in for who is going to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury, it is wishful thinking and nothing more. I would not begin to speculate who it might be.
A biblical perspective on life, culture, and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
And our talkback line is open on 1-800 316 316. Our special guest is David Ould. He's Senior Associate Minister at St John's Anglican Cathedral in Parramatta in Sydney. We are talking about the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury and Justin Welby. He'll be gone. There'll be a successor that will take his place. He's been leading a movement, 85 million Anglicans around the world. And that means Anglicans here in Australia too. And while we're quick to say it's not just the Anglican Church that's in the focus here, in fact, there's no one can really be self-righteous about this so far as their denominational heritage goes, because all sorts of denominations have faced these sorts of scandals or near scandals in recent times. Some people might be thinking of the Hillsong issues around Brian Houston. But these sorts of things, they do come up from time to time, and sometimes even strategically timed, which is an interesting thing we might talk about. But what are your thoughts for Australian scandals too, and how these might be something similar to things that have happened in the UK, David?
Yeah, Neil, I think it's helpful for us to reflect that actually there are a bunch of things that are close to home. So again, I'm an Anglican minister, and the Royal Commission report was pretty scathing on much that happened in the Anglican Church, although we are lots of separate dioceses, and some dioceses did far worse than others. Just north of me in Newcastle, I mean, the report was utterly scathing, ended up with Archbishop Roger Hurft, then the Bishop of Newcastle, and then latterly Archbishop in Perth, ended up with resigning over the way he'd handled these matters. But it's not just the Anglicans. I mean, if you think through to the recent stuff that's gone on in the Pentecostal movement, think about what happened around Brian Houston. Now, we want to be careful about what we say around that. But one thing became very clear, didn't it, as it all sort of erupted around Brian, was that those around him at a sort of effective board level who knew, who had reports, who should have spoken up, they didn't, and they allowed him to continue in the ministry. Another good example would be John McMartin, formerly of Inspire Church here in Sydney as well. Now, of course, McMartin's conviction of a sexual assault was overturned on appeal. We want to be clear about that. I think it's important to say that. But nevertheless, around that, there were suggestions and allegations and reports, and McMartin stayed in his position for many years, with the result now, of course, I know of at least one payment that's been made by the Australian Christian churches as a damages payment to, we'll call them what they are, a victim of McMartin's behaviour. Again, it's the failure of those around who know what's going on, but for one reason or another, it's, we don't want to damage the gospel. You know, we have to work with these people, but they're doing so much good work, and we just end up excusing behavior that actually, if we just sat back and went, oh, hang on, we wouldn't do. And so it's easy to look at something going on the other side of the world and just go, oh, tut, look at them and they got it wrong. But actually, every one of us has that responsibility, don't we, to speak up at the right point. And even when our leaders and our elders can't get it, just find helpful ways to go, look, actually something is not right here, and it needs to be addressed.
Is one of the most important issues here the fact that sometimes leaders in denominations, and let's not even be specific here, want to look out and cover one another's backs, which is obviously what mates do, those friendships, but at the expense of victims who are people who have been innocent supporters, people who've joined a church, people who have inadvertently fallen into or have been groomed in some way into some level of dreadful abuse, and they obviously deserve the primary focus, but the leaders, they're the ones who are in charge of what happens, and so sometimes protecting your mate's more important than protecting the victims. This is something I guess no doubt comes up from time to time in conversations that you have as well. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. Again, I just want to be cautious. I'm pretty scathing about the behaviour, but I want to be cautious about what's going on. In my experience, it's usually just a multiplicity of different things that are happening. Yes, sometimes it's because it's our mates, and that's difficult, isn't it? We set up a ministry, we get the people who know us best to help us and support us and oversee it, but they're our friends. And also in any form of ministry, hopefully those that we're working with most tightly, it's more than just a business relationship. It becomes a deep Christian fellowship with people that we want to have there. And so that becomes an issue. This person is now someone that's dear to me, but this thing has been said about them. Sometimes we just don't know what to do, although I've got to say in 2024, that is less and less of an excuse, given all the things we've learned in the last 20 years. Sometimes it's actually a form of grooming of those around the perpetrator, not just the grooming of the initial victim, but the grooming of those around them as well. So grieving takes on a variety of tiers, and that certainly happens as well. And sometimes it's just the power structures that we're in that tell us not to challenge authority. And that can be from the most traditional places where, one imagines sort of Anglicans and bishops and, deference to authority there. But clearly one of the issues that's been going on in the Pentecostal movement as well is that kind of don't touch the Lord's anointed kind of stuff. And every criticism is just an attack upon this messenger of God. And so it's all these things weaving in together.
Is there a message in there for anyone who might have an aspiration to leadership? And it might be a lower level leadership in your local church, or then it might grow into some higher level leadership, and it might be some sort of oversight over numerous churches in different ways that denominations look like that. But the maturity to have a personal firm foundation on what you know to be good and right, rather than picking sides in church leadership battles that might actually lead you into supporting something that could turn into a scandal. Any thoughts here for people who might be aspiring or just making sense of leadership around this sort of issue?
Yeah, there's so many things that wrap in together. The most fundamental thing that I increasingly are saying to young men and women as they think about these things is know your own heart. Just be utterly realistic about your own propensity to sin, whether it be to sin against other people, whether it to be sin by omitting to act when you know that you should do. Just be thoroughly aware of that, because it's the "it couldn't happen to me" thing that actually causes it to happen to people. I think that's the first thing. When I was much younger, I was given great advice about criticism, and that was, it doesn't matter who the criticism comes from or how bad faith you think it might be, weigh it and sift it carefully. Be prepared to go, look, I think this might be a bit silly, but actually there's some substance to this. I was even today having a conversation with someone where I was just gently wanting to go, look, it doesn't matter who this came from. This is important thing to weigh up. I think those are the critical things. The older I get, the more aware I become of my own propensity to sin, and the more needful I am to have people around me who will tell me when I'm just getting it wrong, and I need to listen to them, Neil.
I often will say, and some listeners will know this is something common, I say sometimes it's a miracle that the church even exists at all. There's so many things can go wrong. Sometimes when we're in church life and we come in with a good impression of church, we want it to be good and we want it to be perfect, but rose-coloured glasses may be a mistake if you are assuming some level of leadership, because no, everything is not right and there will be challenges to resolve.
Oh, well, we're not in the new creation yet, are we? So there's sin. So one of my monikers in pastoral ministry has been often disappointed, never surprised. But I think it's important in those of us who are in any form of leadership where we just say the ends never justify the means. So Jesus must be our model here, right? So he achieves his ends through godly means. You never see him abusing anybody. Like a bruised reed he will not break, says the prophet. So it's just thinking of that, and we have enough lessons now from the past, and we're such a well-informed age that we just don't have an excuse anymore, Neil.
David, let me ask you about this word woke, and
Sure.
Whether it's an appropriate word to be using of a church leader like an archbishop. What were your impressions of Justin Welby and that word woke?
So while I don't think I'd personally use the word woke of him, it's quite clear he's been very influenced by what many people would call the woke agenda. When Welby was appointed in 2013, he was understood to be an evangelical, more conservative on matters, especially on the human sexuality matter that was facing the church. Maybe softer on his expression of it than others. He came through the Holy Trinity Brompton, the HTB sort of circles, so not as conservative as maybe St Helens Bishopsgate or places like that in London, and yet nevertheless an evangelical. And yet even at the time, I do remember writing, he's going to be as big a disappointment to the Conservatives as his predecessor, Rowan Williams, was to the Liberals. And it turns out that was true. So he just basically over that whole period just softened his position, softened until he ended up with the statements early this year that he made on the Rest is Politics podcast, which caused a bit of a stink inside church circles, where he effectively said that sex outside of marriage, not least for homosexual couples, is acceptable in God's eyes, with the usual caveats of within a loving relationship and so on. And he said, look, that's where I've ended up now. Now, the Conservatives, who previously would have counted him as one of their own, that for them was the crystallization of a movement that was very, very clear for a long time. Is he woke? I don't know, but influenced by it, certainly.
So the positions that he took, as you're saying, he wasn't going to be popular either way, and no leadership is popular with everyone, because you're always going to have some people who are your opposition. But when 3,000 churches closed on his watch, what does that say about the way that people saw him in his leadership?
Well, I think what it says is that the positions he took could not stem the tide that was already going out. The Church of England attendance has been just declining. And every time they stepped in an innovation, they said, this will solve things. So the ordination of women to the priesthood, this will solve things. No, down it kept going. Making women bishops, this will solve things. No, it just went down steeper. So he was already presiding over a church plummeting in attendance, and in one sense, not his fault, but he certainly did nothing to stop the slide.
A little bit of compromise, leaving the door open just a little, and all of a sudden it's flung wide open, and all of these things are taking effect, and you've got sort of divisions and splits, dreadful things in church. Yes. Hey, I couldn't help but I Googled a few things this morning before coming on the radio. And there was an article in the homosexual press. And it's an interesting little perspective that I'll bring to you, because we were talking about, the government and the church and the easy or uneasy relationship there. But in the article that I looked at, it said Welby claimed that he had been summoned twice to Parliament and threatened with parliamentary action in an effort to force same-sex marriage on the church. So I just want to bring into here, because while it might be church versus state, as in political leaders, there's also a bureaucracy in the mix, and the homosexual press here, and I think celebrating the fact that that there were people who leaned on him from the bureaucracy to force the same-sex marriage issues. Any thoughts here?
I think I want to just gently correct that, Neil. Not bureaucracy, but the legislature. So obviously there would have been more extreme, as I would view them. They'd see themselves as mainstream, but more left-leaning MPs who would have thought it was just outrageous that the Church of England, as a body of the state, were not allowing same-sex marriages when the state as a whole had legislated for them years ago. I think wiser heads, however, prevailed. You cannot underestimate in England still today that kind of sense of, gosh, we've got to do things in the proper way. We've got to everyone just calm down a little bit. And so wiser heads prevailed over that one. And so while there'll always be noisy noises saying, they must do this, they must do that, it's outrageous, it doesn't happen that quickly. But yes, there was huge social public pressure on the Church of England to conform, as there always is on the church in every age, to conform to the nation around it. Sadly, Welby really, whatever his protestations are, really he has been heavily influenced by that, hasn't he? And you can see that by the positions he ended up taking on same-sex marriage.
Let me ask you about what's different about the UK, and perhaps in contrast with Australia here, because there are people who rise into political roles, or, maybe a seat in the House of Lords, and I think that even Justin Welby had that seat, and maybe that's under threat now, I don't know, but there's a different sort of a way that school systems and all sorts of things, your education matters and where you got educated. What are your thoughts here as to how this might even contribute into the leadership and control of the worldwide Anglican communion?
Sure. So there is a class system in England. Let's just be really clear about that in a way that perhaps as Australians we're never going to understand. The Ewan camps, which John Smythe led and ran, formerly known as the Bash camps, they drew boys, young men, from the three main what were called public schools in England, but actually are the three most prestigious schools. So the most famous one of which was Eton, which Welby himself went to. Now, you have to be very wealthy and well positioned to get your boy into Eton. So just having the cash won't do. You have to get through the interview, which is where you go, perhaps you're not the right sort for this school, young man. So these are the men young boys who from the very beginning are told they will be running the country one day. And so men like Smythe said, well, why don't we win them for Christ? Or at least their version of what Christianity was. So you can see a very tactical approach. And that's why a young man like Welby would find himself attending this camp. He's been marked out for leadership. But this is happening because within the Church of England, of conservative evangelicals who belong to that class, and they see themselves, and still do today, see themselves as the appropriate and right leaders of the evangelicals. And this has been one of the main complaints that's been going on within the evangelical wing of the church in England, broader than just the Church of England, that's the church in England. And you see it over the Jonathan Fletcher affair, which is related to this, where the same men, the accusation is the same men who kind of just looked past Fletcher's wrongdoings and who came from this, and Fletcher was one of the Ewan camp men, the same people who looked past that still kind of want to act like they're in charge. And so you've just got this whole class system where a certain tier of self-appointed leaders just can't get their head around, it seems to me, that other people might actually run the joint. And if you just, if you can't get your head around it, just watch an episode or two of Downton Abbey and just ask who thinks they're in charge here.
I can't get over the, you mentioned that these camps had a nickname called Bash camps. I'm assuming that that's because parents and the students might have assumed that this is what happens. No, that's nothing to do with the discipline.
No, it's from the name of someone previously called Bash.
Oh, right.
It's deeply ironic. And I think it's probably worth mentioning at this point that clearly not everybody at those camps knew what was going on. Smythe was a very typical abuser. He picked on individuals, he groomed them, he isolated them. And so I think you've got to be fair to someone like Welby. Welby could very well have been in the same dormitory that Smythe was looking after, been around these things and not known that it was going on until he was told about it. And he clearly was told about it in the 80s.
Let's talk about that sort of feeling that you might have that something's not quite in line here. Sometimes people might even refer to these sorts of things as an intuition. I'm a part of a church, and let's just bring this back to our Australian soil as well. And no matter what denomination you might be thinking of, you might be part of, when you've got a gut feeling that something may not be quite right, what sort of action ought you take? Any thoughts here from you?
Yeah, you absolutely have to do something, and these thoughts are not mine own or original. One of the books that's really profoundly impacted me in the last couple of years, and I reviewed it on my website, is Wade Mullen's Something's Not Right, which is exactly the right title for this kind of book. That suspicion something's not right. And he talks about bullying abusive leaders and the people around them who don't deal with things. What do you do? I want to say two things. One, you must speak up. You must try and make people see. But I think the other thing that I would add, Neil, is as you do that, be aware of the sorts of things that will stop the people that you're talking to taking what you say seriously. So be conscious that they may have to grapple with the fact that this is their friend. Be conscious of the fact that they may have to grapple with the fact that this is someone that they see as being an authority that should not be challenged. Take those things into account, but you must speak up. And then, if necessary, you must leave. I think often there's a really good thing is a really well-done resignation with a well-written letter that is good and godly and gracious, not unnecessarily bitter, but Mullen's book is so good because it teaches us to trust our intuition on that. It shows us the patterns of behavior of bullying leadership and of acquiescent leadership around them.
So go with your intuition. I guess be prepared that once you've made some investigation and your intuition was wrong, to be back on side and back on the team. But when you do have a gut feeling, and just interesting too, because, parents who hear things from their children, when you're listening to impressions that people have, and I want to stop short of calling these things gossip, but, because we want to discourage, gossip in church life, and even be able to, to be able to discern what's gossip and what's something that you should act on. These are the sorts of things, this is the sort of wisdom that parents need to be working with, to have a good experience of maturity growth in your church?
Yeah, absolutely. And parents listening to children is a great one to chat through. I had an incident a number of years ago where one of my children came to me, and not that I'm the expert on this, but I think this might be a helpful model, reported to me something that a peer of theirs had said to them at school about what clearly was abusive behavior they were experiencing. And so our instinct, it's really interesting. Our instinct is to go, oh, that can't be true. They must be making it up. But actually, what I've now learned to do is to say to my child, thank you so much for letting me know about that. Can I just ask you a few more questions about what they said? And then you ask open-ended questions. So tell me what they said. Tell me what you think their mood was. Like, you see, that's an open question. You don't say, do you think they're lying? And then we did what we have to do is I said to him, you've been really, really brave. Now what we have to do is go and talk to the right teacher at school about this. I will make that happen. I'm going to be with you in the whole time, but we have to do that for the sake of this, your peer who, I can't remember the details now, Neil, but would have said, don't tell anybody, and so on. And those classic things. And I took him in and we had a really good conversation with the school authorities who I know well. They took it very seriously and it got progressed and dealt with in the proper way. So yes, it's important that we have our eyes open to this. And actually, it is the classic thing. Yes, there have been some people who've made false allegations in the past, but people normally do not make this kind of stuff up. And the other thing I would say as well, Neil, is sometimes people do say something. Sometimes you walk into a situation where there's obviously two sides, and there's great wisdom, isn't there? In Proverbs, the writer says, "There's a way that seems right to a man," and then I paraphrase, "until the other guy opens his mouth." And so you do want to be a little bit careful, especially if you're in leadership and you have to weigh things up. Don't just take the first person's view. I have found out I've been in pastoral ministry now for 16, getting on 17 years. Here's one of the things I've learned: people will come to you and say something to you, and it sounds very compelling. Stop, pause, listen to the other side, weigh it carefully, and weigh what you're actually being told. And usually you can begin to see clearly what's going on. Maybe the first person's right, maybe the second person has a point of view, but you can begin to weigh it and see what's going on. And that our leadership would do that. That they would listen to complaints and weigh them seriously. We would not have had some of the scandals that we've endured in the last 10 years if that had happened.
And some of these things might seem cumbersome, but I would say all church denominations have clear policies in child protection that are there in place to protect the parishioners, the people who are sitting in their church, whether they be children or whether they be adults. Churches are well developed, well mature, having all the inquiries that we've had into these things. There's real confidence, I think, that we can have now that there are policies and there are procedures in place if there is this sort of allegation that might arise.
Yes, Neil, but it has to be more than box ticking. So it's one thing to put in place a policy. It's another thing to have the people who are responsible for responding to things actually genuinely being committed to implementation of that policy. So, Hillsong had a policy. Inspired Church had a policy. The Anglican churches, I don't want to keep pointing things at other people. As Anglican churches, we've had policies and we have policies it's not just about having the policy right. It's about us owning our responsibility and seeing these things for what they are and actually acting upon them.
Hasn't been a lot of calls this hour, but let's take a call.
Sure.
Alex is in Melbourne. Hello, Alex. Welcome.
Oh, hello, Neil and your guest. I'm just looking at Numbers chapter 25, where the children of Israel started to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab, and how God approaches this problem and how He acts. It really shows the difference between the way we act and how God looks upon these things. And
just remind us here, Numbers 25. What are you gleaning here, Alex? How did God deal with it?
And say verse 4, and the Lord said unto Moses, verse 3, and Israel joined himself unto Baal Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said unto Moses, take all the heads, that is the rulers of the people, and hang them up before the Lord against the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. They've been there for a while, and that's what started to happen. And the Lord's looking at the leaders, and Moses said unto the judges of Israel, lay ye every one his men that were joined unto Baal Peor. And then while all this is going on, one of the leaders' sons and brings in a Moab woman into a tent, and then Phinehas gets a javelin and thrusts it through both of them.
Alex, you're reminding us that not all the stories in the Bible are children's stories. In fact, there's so many adult stories, but you're also reminding us that while we might have an impression of a loving, benevolent God with a big white beard who's just, malleable in our hands, that ultimately He is a just God and that He doesn't have a sensitive ear to the sorts of compromise that brings disloyalty to Him. Let's bring our special guest, David. Your thoughts here for Alex. Might need more unpacking, but your thoughts.
Yeah, hi, Alex. Thanks for adding that to the conversation. You're right. It does show God's utter intolerance of I think I want to say spiritual compromise. The issue, it seems to me, is Baal worship and all that comes of it more than anything else that's going on there in Numbers 25. It is the Old Testament covenant people of God, and so God deals with them in a different way, notwithstanding the fact that that's a serious matter for them. I think the other thing I would be saying, Neil, is it is helpful for us to remember that God Himself is the righteous judge. He sees all things and He knows all things. We often don't, and we probably need to be a little bit more careful, but that underlying sentiment that actually we ought to have a great desire for the purity of God's church and think about what that means for us in our day, that certainly is true. The New Testament injunctions are to cast out those who are persistently in sin for their own sake and hand them over so that God can deal with them.
There's a lot of depth in having a conversation like that, but I want to thank Alex in Melbourne for great insight to be able to offer into our conversation today. And let's squeeze in one more call. Graham's in Orange in New South Wales. Hey, Graham, welcome.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you for your welcome.
Graham, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm interested in the local scene. There's a book just been published called Crimes of the Cross, and it's about the Anglican paedophile network. It wasn't just individuals, it's a whole pile of Anglican priests, and they were ignored by the people who were being abused. But certainly it is sad because the Anglican community said nothing, which I think people close ranks about when something like this happens. It happens at universities and a number of places, including ministers' fraternals and every other place where they try and protect their own closed ranks. I just like an opinion on the fact that Morpeth is a liberal college and has become woke in these areas, and whether statistically there's much lower amount of child abuse going on places like the Anglican diocese in Sydney.
Graham, good insight here. David, your thoughts for Graham?
Yeah, Graham, that's a great question, a great observation. Crimes of the Cross is a fantastic, recently published book, concentrating mainly on what happened in the Diocese of Newcastle, where it was pretty appalling. Professor Patrick Parkinson, who's a major contributor to that book, wrote an article very recently on the ABC News and Ethics website, where he makes a really helpful observation. He goes, look, it should be no surprise that these things happened in a theological environment where there was not clarity on on what we might call conservative traditional sexual ethics, and those that breached that, particularly in the area he notes of homosexual behavior, those that breached that basically were told, we're not so worried about the boundaries, and he effectively argues, well, in that environment, boundaries, really, we're not going to police them. No wonder that often the same men then went about doing other things as well, and operated in an environment where there was some laxity, and it gave them an implied permission, they thought, to do what they wanted to do. And then afterwards, you can't scream and go, oh, we have no idea where this came from. So Parkinson's point, I think, is well made, and I think that might be where Graham's pushing to.
Graham, I want to thank you so much for your call. We have run out of time. In fact, we're just squeezing into a little bit overtime here. But one last thought, perhaps, drawing any loose ends together, David, is there a way back from this way that the church is struggling under these sorts of circumstances, or has this always been the way that church goes, or is this now the new normal? A thought or two from you on where to from here?
Couple of wrap-up thoughts. Yes, it's always been the same way. Humans have always been the same. We're just far more aware of it now in the internet age, so we become more aware of this. And of course, there are bloggers who make these things aware. Is there a way back? Well, the church will continue, and we're warned, aren't we, even in the New Testament, in the first century, of those who will abuse the flock and do things for their own gain. So we fair warning, it's always happened. I think I would want to say a couple of things. One, we need to stop having people go back in the pulpit and back into leadership when it becomes clear they're unfit for it. That surely is one of the lessons we've got. We need to get right on that, and we need to learn from the lessons of the last 20 years of how we've failed to handle sexual abuse and abuse of women in domestic violence in particular, and now sort of the wider bullying issues that are coming up, and have the courage to go, enough, and even if it is my best friend or my brother that did this, enough, for their sakes, let alone the sake of the flock. We need to protect the sheep, and also have great confidence that Jesus is more than capable of looking after his church and will continue to do so.
Well, David Ould, I'd be very surprised if the next time you are on the preaching roster at St. John's Anglican Cathedral in Parramatta, that the place is not overflowing. I think listeners, and especially Sydney-sider listeners today, will be wanting to connect with you in some way. This sort of wisdom, some might say, is rare, and just wonderful to have had your insights today on 2020. To connect with David, there's a website you can go to, and you can catch some of the very insightful blog items that David regularly writes, davidould.net. Now, old is not as in aged. In fact, he's quite a young man. David Ould, OULD.net. David, thanks so much for taking some time. I look forward already to the next time we get a chance to talk, but thanks so much for being with us on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Always good to be with you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.